Pessoal, estou trazendo o vídeo original, legendado de Mike Benson, o assessor de Trump, que hoje fez as grandes denúncias do dia de 22, do período eleitoral. É importante que vocês vejam esse vídeo tem 18 minutos aproximadamente, ele é todo legendado, mas ele conta todo o passo a passo da questão da perseguição, das big techs, da censura, como foi feito, como era injetado o dinheiro da agência Usaid, né? Então, esse vídeo é importante que vocês vejam, porque ele é esclarecedor, bombástico, como dizem aí, tá bom? Deus, pátria e família. Inscrevam-se no canal, comentem, compartilhem, mas esse vídeo é de suma importância. Compartilhem, porque está sendo desvendado todo o mistério de 2022. Quanto o presidente Bolsonaro foi perseguido.
How exactly are we influencing all these other countries to jump on board with this?
A number of means. So,
do they know that we're influencing them?
well, certainly the connective touch points certainly do, because I'll give you an example. Brazil. So Brazil has this tyrant judge, de Moraes, right? This is the current war between Elon and this, the head of Brazil's censorship court. It's called the TSE. It's a subcourt of Brazil's Supreme Court, the STF. And so a lot of people see the actions of this one tyrant judge who basically has this ability to issue an edict, and then anything posted online becomes instantly criminal. Sitting parliamentarians in Brazil call the current president, Lula, a thief. And the judge says, you're not allowed to say that. The person faces, a criminal judgment for demeaning the current president. Going after journalists, going after politicians, going after ordinary civilians by any edict. But there's a whole censorship substructure to what de Moraes is involved in. There's advisory councils. There's a whole coterie of flaggers who propose the things to be flagged, who do the technical work of the sort of AI scanning, who do the narrative network mapping. If they want to say anyone who challenges the results of Brazil's 2022 election, well, they need these outside institutions to create this whole narrative network map. Well, these are U.S. funded and U.S. backed channel institutions who provide the entire substructure to the head of the snake. The analogy that I've been giving on this is it's a Brazilian spider, but the spider web was laid by the U.S. State Department, USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy. I can go through all their roles. And the fangs of it are star-spangled spangs. This is the U.S. the U.S. State Department trying to take out its political opposition in Brazil. They went to war with Bolsonaro. They called him Trump of the tropics. They're waging the same campaign against Bolsonaro that they did through their own intermediaries to take out Trump during his term, to censor him on the internet there, and that they're using to censor Trump today through their work with the EU. They're just doing that in Brazil to stop Bolsonaro. This story goes back at least 6 years to the U.S. State Department's involvement in censoring Brazil. So almost all Bolsonaro supporters in the run-up to the 2018 Brazilian election were deemed to be populists by the U.S. State Department. Populism, again, is this watchword where this Department of Dirty Tricks power that I laid out all hinges on this word democracy. We have this concept that democracy is, this set of democratic institutions, and that if the popular will opposes these democratic institutions, we call that an attack on democracy, because even if the people want it, it still violates these safeguards that are held in place. This is how we say, we don't let another Adolf Hitler rise to power, is because we don't allow demagogues appealing to the masses to take democracy outside of the bumper cars of the bowling lane. And so this is our sort of special set of skills the blob has. If we can't get them on terrorism grounds or military grounds, this is part of how we waged the Cold War. Communism, even if a country was minding its own business, we said that, well, it's a communist structure that's depriving the people of their yearnings for democracy. And so we get to play God. We get to use our CIA and our State Department and our Usaid and our paramilitary back channels to do a top-down military coup, as we did in Brazil in 1964, or a bottom-up color revolution, as we did in Ukraine in 2014 and dozens of other countries. But populism is the new communism. Populism is the new counterterrorism. This is something I think that a lot of conservatives who may be listening really need to process, because this CIA, State Department, Usaid military apparatus had the support of the Republican Party throughout the entire 20th century as it was toppling left-wing socialist, left-wing communist governments. It was not until Trump won in 2016, or Brexit 4 or 5 months before that, and then the rise around the world of these right-wing populist politicians, from Abe in Japan to Modi in India to Bolsonaro in Brazil to that whole European axis I laid out that stretches all the way from France into the Baltics, that there became this flip. The CIA, the State Department, they still oppose left-wing socialism, communism, but the biggest threat that they see is right-wing populism. Neoliberalism, the blob's sort of financial motto, can be flanked from either side, from its left-wing socialist flank or from its right-wing nationalist flank. And so this is why they went after Bolsonaro and tried to stop him from winning in 2018. Bolsonaro supporters were censored on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, all the major platforms between 2017 and 2018. So they started to take to end-to-end encrypted chats in order to circumvent that censorship. So that's WhatsApp and Telegram are the main players there. And also, for folks who are familiar with this alternative social media platform, Gab, which was one of the sort of early pre-Parler, social media alternatives, one of their first early demographic bases, other than people in the U.S., were Brazilians, because they had nowhere to go because they were censored because of all this government pressure on them in Brazil. But they took to WhatsApp and Telegram, and I did a report on this 2.5 years ago, my foundation published it, about this strange web in 2018 that was established, funded to the tune of millions of dollars, jointly by 3 government and quasi-government agencies: the U.S. State Department, Usaid, and the National Endowment for Democracy. The State Department is formally sets U.S. foreign policy for the region. You have Usaid, which is supposed to be this independent agency, but it's essentially logistical support for the State Department. It's sort of plausibly deniable support for either the State Department, the Pentagon, or the CIA. Many times Usaid has been busted as a CIA front, and we can go through that if your audience is curious. It's a kind of an incredible tale of how much. I'm actually curious if you, in your time, either in the SEALs or as a contractor, ever ran into Usaid as a strange player in some of the side stories. But the fact is these institutions pump millions of dollars into in the U.S. into Brazilian institutions. So they pump the money into Brazilian university centers who do thought leadership on countering disinformation, into legal scholars in Brazil who formulate policy and help develop the legislative anti-misinformation laws or anti-fake news laws, who serve on the advisory councils, who essentially help make this consensus decision about who should be censored by the Brazilian TSE. And even many of the partnered flaggers to actually target who should be censored in Brazil are U.S. State Department and USAID funded U.S. National Endowment for Democracy funded institutions, like the Atlantic Council, for example, which actually serves as one of the trusted flaggers of the Brazilian TSE court. Demores, his court has about 70 of these trusted flaggers in his program. And one of them is the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council has 7 CIA directors on its board. It receives annual funding every year from the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Marines. Annual funding from the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout. It receives millions of dollars from U.S. taxpayers. It was also partnered with Burisma, by the way, this NATO think tank. It has 7 CIA directors on its board, and lo and behold, it is serving as the deputy arm of Demores in Brazil, even creating network maps of who to be censored. Same thing with institutions like the Wilson Center. Same thing with institutions like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which, by the way, is the institution that was run from 2014 to 2021 by a man named Bill Burns. You may be familiar with that name. Bill Burns is the current director of the CIA. He left the Carnegie Endowment to run the CIA. And the Carnegie Endowment is, it has its fingerprints all over this Brazil censorship situation. And it gets worse than that. We have formal government programs now that are essentially coordinated, quarterbacked by the State Department, but are sort of run at the operational level and funded by the State Department, Usaid, and the National Endowment for Democracy, which is this CIA cutout, basically created in 1983 when our then CIA director was complaining that the CIA had lost too many powers after the Church Committee hearings in 1976. So we needed to do CIA work through a non-CIA entity called the National Endowment for Democracy. Hunter Biden was on the chairman's advisory board, by the way, of the DNC branch of that. It's called the NDI, which plays a major role in the Brazil censorship situation. They created this network called the D4D, Design for Democracy in Brazil, where they sprawled into a spider web dozens of these high-level censorship thought leaders, advocates, activists, legal scholars. Again, this is backchanneled by a CIA cutout in order to get these censorship laws passed and provide the political and media support for them to take the heavy-handed action that they did. And again, just to put a button on some of this, because we can go a lot deeper into this, but if folks recall, just ahead of the 2022 election, where Bolsonaro lost in a razor-close, nail-biter election, very similar to our own in the 2020 cycle, all three wings of the blob, the State Department, the CIA, and the Pentagon, all went down to Brazil to intermediate that election. The State Department pulled strings to Taiwan Semiconductor to stop giving semiconductor supplies, stop prioritizing the United States, and give those supplies to Brazil so that essentially Brazilian election officials could use 3 to 4 times more voting machines than they'd ever used. Bolsonaro said, I don't trust these voting machines. The State Department had just spent U.S. taxpayer dollars and deprioritized our access to semiconductors during a semiconductor crisis shortfall to give it to a foreign country so that they could have electronic voting machines for their election. Why is that in U.S. national interest? Why should truck drivers making $50K a year have to pay their income tax for electronic voting machines that the Brazilians didn't even ask for? Then Bill Burns, the CIA director, went down and personally threatened Bolsonaro not to, quote, cast doubt on the electronic voting machines that the State Department had just rammed down their throat. And then Lloyd Austin, the head of the Pentagon, went down to Brazil to talk to the Brazilian military to say, if there's a disputed election result, don't you dare side with Bolsonaro, because there'll be military repercussions. Much of your Brazilian military supplies and infrastructure and training comes from the U.S. So That was just at the technical level of the election. What I'm describing is all the censorship that went into that and that happened in the aftermath as part of this transitional justice campaign to stop Bolsonaro's reemergence.
Who is the head of all of this? Where's this all coming from?
Well, there's a peculiar government program that's called again, this is all intermediate through the interagency, right? So there's going to be some National Security Council vision for what to do in the Western Hemisphere and what to do in Brazil in particular, because you have all these different elements. You have the Pentagon elements, you have the State Department elements, you have the USAID elements. All these are different permanent seats on the National Security Council. They need to be coordinated through the NSC process. So technically, I would say it's the NSC Western Hemisphere folks. But to make this sort of really simple, there's a formal government program. It's called the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening. Say that again. The Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening. How nice, how quaint, how understated. And this has been a U.S. government State Department program, which is co-funded and largely funded by USAID, in order to help foreign countries develop more robust election election infrastructure, and to make sure their own internal political systems are strengthened democratically, which effectively means to make sure they're more of a vassal of the U.S. State Department, so that anything that happens in that country's internal politics do not undermine the State Department's vision for the development of that region. Now, starting in 2021, CEPS, the Consortium for Elections and Political Process Strengthening, began to really add this censorship disinformation component to its international diplomacy toolkit. This idea that where we previously said, democracy and political process strengthening meant providing voice to minority factions in that country's government who were underrepresented by the will of the majority, or protections for the press. Now, of course, all these things are quite cynical. Oftentimes, the State Department will be working with those, particular identity faction groups, or it will be funding, USAID-funded media or U.S. Agency for Global Development-funded media to influence that. So we make sure there are press protections, there are civil society protections. Again, all of this is to protect our own control over that country. But they began to say that as part of this political process strengthening, you have to have robust counter-disinformation, counter-misinformation measures in your country in order to be in line with best practices for democracy. And so CEPS has this sprawling Brazil program, which coordinates with the National Endowment for Democracy, this NDI, where Hunter Biden was the chairman's advisory committee, this Design for Democracy coalition that I was just talking about, all these different university centers, all these different government-funded media ecosystem players, all these different fact checkers, all these different AI scan and banners, all these different disinformation flaggers, all these different legal scholars are all in this umbrella network under CEPS. And this is playing out as the House Foreign Affairs Committee has done absolutely nothing. They had just took out a U.S. national champion, X. The State Department's job is to protect the welfare of U.S. citizen interests, U.S. corporate interests, and U.S. national interests in the region. They just see Starlink's assets. That's a major component of our military, frankly, in terms of its interface with telecom. They just banned our soft power projection of X into the country, but that is because X is caught in a proxy war between the State Department and Bolsonaro. You can bet if Bolsonaro had banned Twitter 1.0 because too many Lula supporters were using Twitter and were outflanking Bolsonaro on Twitter 1.0 in 2021, if he had banned X, how fast Brazil would have been kicked off the dollar, how fast international sanctions, blockades to their trade supplies, trade embargoes, private sector retrenchment of investments, the whole litany of our Department of Dirty Tricks toolkit would have been crammed down Bolsonaro so fast if he had done that. But that's because they wanted him to lose. They wanted Lula to win. It's as simple as that. What's happening in Brazil has really much less to do with free speech as it has to do with the State Department and the blob's designs for who needs to win that election. And they also need to do it cheaply. It's very expensive to constantly manage each new election. And so they have this policy of transitional justice and stabilization so that after the State Department overthrows a country or runs tens of millions of dollars to a political opposition and they barely win an election, we have this new policy of transitional justice where we arrest all the opposition leaders. Bolsonaro right now is under countless indictments, just as Trump is here. And they censor all the forces around that, so they prevent the mobilization and the coordination of that party's resurgence. They can't get their messaging out. Their media is all banned. And so that way, it's cheap to manage. You might need to spend $50 million, $100 million to rig it in 2018, but in 2020, because after the stabilization process plays out, you might only need 10 million because they're polling so low because all their media is banned and all their politicians are arrested. So It's a very nasty playbook.